My parents said they wanted to be fair. That sentence is still stuck in my head because everything that followed proved the opposite. We were sitting in the living room, the same room where I grew up being told to be patient, to compromise, to understand. Papers were neatly arranged on the table, as if this was some office meeting and not a family decision that would quietly shape the rest of my life. My father cleared his throat, my mother avoided eye contact, and my sister sat straight, already knowing more than she let on. They handed my sister the apartment first. It was in the city, newly built. Secure building, elevator, parking space, clean white walls, sunlight pouring in through big windows. My mother smiled when she explained it, using words like convenient, safe, and future-proof. My sister nodded, pretending to be surprised, but I could see relief on her face. This was easy. This made sense. Then my father slid another set of keys across the table toward me. He said, "This one is yours." No excitement, no pride, just keys. I asked where it was, and he gave me an address I barely recognized, on the outskirts of town. An old area people usually passed through, not moved into. He added almost casually, "It's a house, so technically you're getting more." That word, technically, did a lot of work in that moment. When I went to see it the first time, the unfairness hit me hard. The gate barely opened. The paint on the walls had peeled so much you could see layers of neglect underneath. The roof sagged in one corner, and weeds had swallowed what used to be a garden. Inside, the air smelled old, like damp paper and dust that had settled for years without being disturbed. This wasn't a fix-it-slowly situation. This was something people walked away from. I didn't complain. That's important. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse anyone. I had learned long ago that being the understanding one meant swallowing disappointment quietly. When I mentioned repairs, my parents said things like, "You're good with managing things, and you're more patient than your sister." It was always framed as a compliment, even when it felt like a burden. My sister never came with me to the house, not once. She joked about it from a distance, saying things like, "At least you have land," or "You can turn it into something someday." But she never asked how bad it really was. She didn't want to see it. The strange part was my parents' behavior after the handover. They checked on my sister's apartment regularly, asked about maintenance, neighbors, bills. With me, it was different. They never asked how the house was holding up. They never offered help. It was like once the keys were handed over, the place stopped existing to them. That should have been my first warning. The neighbors were the second. On my second week there, while I was trying to fix a leaking pipe, an elderly man from across the street stopped by. He didn't introduce himself right away. He just looked at the house, then at me, and said, "So someone finally moved back in." Back in. Not moved in. Back in. I asked him what he meant, but he just smiled in a tired way and said, "Your parents didn't tell you, did they?" Before I could ask more, he wished me luck and walked away slowly, like he had already said too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the noise or the cold, but because something about this situation didn't sit right. This house wasn't just old. It felt abandoned on purpose, ignored, almost hidden. And yet my parents had kept it all these years, only to suddenly decide it was mine. When I called my mother and asked about the house's history, her tone changed. She said, "Why are you digging into old things?" and reminded me that I should be grateful. My father later added, "Not everything needs to be questioned." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about favoritism. This house carried something they didn't want to explain. At that point, I still believed the story they wanted me to believe, that my sister got the better deal and I got the short end of the stick. I didn't know yet that this feeling of loss was exactly what they expected. They thought I would accept it, struggle quietly, maybe sell it one day and move on. They didn't know I would stay. They didn't know I would start noticing things. And they definitely didn't know that the worst gift in the room was never the house. It was the silence. Living in that house felt less like moving forward and more like stepping into someone else's unfinished sentence. Every day revealed a new problem: cracked tiles, loose wiring, doors that refused to close properly. But none of it bothered me as much as the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. Not yet. Or maybe not ever. What stood out was how alone the experience was. When my sister moved into her apartment, it became a family event. My parents helped her choose curtains, argued over furniture, discussed security and resale value. Photos were shared in the family group chat. Everyone had opinions, everyone cared. With me, there was silence. I stopped mentioning repairs because every time I did, the response was the same. "You wanted independence, or you can handle it." Sometimes my mother would add, A house is always better than an apartment, as if repeating it enough times would make it true. I noticed they never asked to visit. Not once did they say, "We'll come see how it's going." At first, I thought it was neglect. Later, I realized it was avoidance. The house had habits. That sounds strange, but it's the only way I can describe it. Certain rooms felt colder no matter the weather. The back wall had marks where something had once been mounted, shelves, maybe, or tools, but there was no record of it. Under the stairs, I found scratches on the wood, like something heavy had been dragged in and out repeatedly over the years. This wasn't just a place people lived in. It was a place things were done quietly. One afternoon, I went to the local office to transfer utility bills into my name. The clerk typed in the address, frowned, and typed again. She asked me to confirm the spelling. Then she said something odd. "We don't get many requests for this property." I laughed it off and said it was old. She nodded, but before handing me the papers, she asked, "Are you the owner?" I said yes, because that's what I believed. She paused, then said, "All right," in a tone that suggested the conversation wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. Later that week, I received a property tax notice. It wasn't addressed to my parents. It wasn't addressed to me either. It listed a name I recognized instantly, my grandfather S. He had died years before I was born, and yet here was his name, printed clearly, tied to the land beneath my feet. I called my father immediately. He sounded irritated, not surprised. He told me it was an old record and that I shouldn't worry about it. When I pressed him, he snapped and said, "You're making problems where there are none." That was unlike him. My father was usually calm, measured. This reaction felt defensive. I started paying attention to my sister in a different way, too. Whenever I mentioned the house, even casually, she changed the subject. Once, when I joked about how much work it needed, she said, "You could always sell it," and then quickly added, "I mean, if you want." Her voice gave her away. She wanted me to sell it. She wanted the problem gone. One evening, while I was clearing out an old cabinet, I found a bundle of letters tied with twine. They weren't addressed to me or my parents. They were addressed to my grandfather from people whose names I didn't recognize. Most of them mentioned boundaries, access, and agreements. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just careful language like people protecting something valuable. That was when I understood something important. This house was not the asset. The land was, and land doesn't lose value just because the building on it does. The more I looked, the more signs appeared. The plot was larger than I had been told. The boundary markers didn't match the official description my father had given me. The neighbors treated me with a strange mix of respect and caution, as if they were waiting to see what I would do. One evening, the same elderly neighbor who had spoken to me earlier invited me for tea. He talked about the area, about how things used to be before development moved outward. He mentioned my grandfather again, this time with admiration. "He was careful," the man said. "Not everyone liked that." I asked what he meant. He smiled and said, "Careful men make impatient enemies." When I asked my parents again about my grandfather's connection to the land, my mother said, "That generation worried about things that don't matter anymore." But her hands were shaking slightly when she said it. That's when the story I had been telling myself started to fall apart. This wasn't about favoritism alone. It wasn't about giving one child more comfort and another more responsibility. This was about something unresolved, something unfinished that had been quietly passed to me because everyone else was hoping I wouldn't notice. They underestimated my curiosity. They thought I would focus on the broken walls and leaking pipes. They never imagined I would look beneath them. Because once you start asking who really owns the ground you're standing on, everything above it begins to feel unstable. Once the doubt settled in, it changed how I saw everything. The house didn't feel unlucky anymore. It felt guarded, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see whether I would walk away or stay long enough to understand it. I began checking things properly, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. If I was going to live there, I needed to know what I was standing on. I visited the local land records office, expecting a simple confirmation that my parents had delayed paperwork or forgotten a transfer. What I found instead was confusion. The clerk scrolled through records, paused, and then asked me how I was related to the original owner. "Grandson," I said. She nodded slowly and replied, "That makes sense." Those 3 words hit harder than any argument could have. They didn't say everything is in order. They said this explains it. According to the records, the land had never been officially transferred out of my grandfather's name. There were notes, annotations about intended inheritance, about delayed execution, about family settlement that was to be finalized. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just unfinished business that no one had bothered to close because no one thought it would matter. Except now it did. When I told my parents I had gone to the records office, the reaction was immediate. My father accused me of being disrespectful. My mother said I was embarrassing the family by asking unnecessary questions. They didn't deny what I had found. They just didn't want me to continue. That silence was confirmation. My sister called me that night. She didn't ask what I found. She asked why I was digging. She said things like, "Can't you just let things be? And you're going to create tension for no reason." For the first time, I heard fear in her voice. Not concern for me, fear for stability. A few days later, while repairing a loose floorboard near the back room, I discovered a shallow compartment beneath the wood. It wasn't hidden in a dramatic way. It was practical, almost boring. Inside were old copies of agreements, folded carefully, protected from moisture. Some had my grandfather's signature. Others had names I recognized from street signs and nearby plots. One document stood out. It was a handwritten note from my grandfather, short and direct. He wrote that the land was not to be sold easily, not to be divided for convenience, and not to be handed to anyone who treated it as disposable. He didn't name a beneficiary. He didn't need to. Reading it, I understood something my parents never said out loud. They hadn't given me this house because they trusted me less. They had given it to me because I was the only one they believed would tolerate the inconvenience long enough to keep it. The unfairness I felt at the beginning shifted into something else, realization. My sister's apartment was clean, legal, and simple because it came with no history. No responsibility beyond monthly payments and maintenance fees. My inheritance came with questions, expectations, and consequences. I confronted my parents again, this time without anger. I told them I knew the land wasn't technically theirs to give. My father sat down. My mother cried. Not loudly. Just quietly, like someone who had been holding a weight for too long. They admitted what they had never said before. The land had caused arguments in the family for years. My grandfather had refused to divide it. He believed fragmentation would destroy its value. After he died, no one wanted to deal with the legal complexity or the emotional weight of his decision. Letting the house decay was easier than confronting what it represented. Giving it to me solved two problems at once. It removed responsibility from them, and it placed it on someone they assumed wouldn't push back. They were wrong. I didn't accuse them. I didn't threaten legal action. I simply told them I wasn't selling and I wasn't walking away. That unsettled them more than anger ever could. My sister stayed quiet throughout the conversation. Later, she told me she had always known the land mattered, but she didn't want to be the one carrying it. That night, alone in the house, I reread my grandfather's note. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't loving. It was practical. He had trusted time more than people. He knew that whoever stayed long enough would eventually learn why the land mattered. I finally understood why the house looked the way it did. Neglect wasn't an accident. It was a filter. Anyone looking for quick comfort would have left. Anyone looking only at appearances would have sold. What remained was someone willing to sit with inconvenience, ask questions, and carry something heavier than walls and roofs. The gift wasn't unfair. It was selective. And the moment I accepted that, the house stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a test I had already passed without realizing it. After that conversation, nothing in my family sounded the same anymore. Words that once felt normal, responsibility, fairness, sacrifice, now carried weight. My parents spoke carefully around me, like people afraid of saying the wrong thing and reopening something they had hoped would stay buried. My sister became distant, polite but guarded, as if our shared history had quietly split into two versions of the same story. The house, however, felt different. Not warmer, not friendlier, just honest. I decided to stop treating it like a temporary problem and started living in it fully. I fixed what I could, not to increase value, but to understand it. Every repair revealed traces of deliberate choices. High-quality stone hidden behind crumbling plaster. Thick foundation walls that could easily support something far larger than the structure sitting on top of them. This wasn't a poor man's house. It was a waiting one. The neighbors began to talk more once they realized I wasn't leaving. They stopped offering vague warnings and started sharing small details. How surveyors had come years ago and been turned away. How developers once made quiet inquiries that went nowhere. How my grandfather had been firm but fair, and how some people resented him for it. One evening, the elderly neighbor told me something that finally connected all the loose threads. He said my grandfather had refused a deal that would have changed the entire area. Roads, buildings, money, a lot of it. He believed selling would erase something that couldn't be rebuilt. When he died, everyone assumed time would finish the job he refused to start. Time almost did. My parents visited the house for the first time since the handover. They walked slowly, awkwardly, like guests in a place they didn't own emotionally. My father commented on the repairs. My mother stood quietly in the doorway of the back room, the one with the hidden compartment. She looked tired, not guilty. Tired, she said. He always thought you were patient. That was the closest thing to an explanation I ever got. My sister called me a week later, asking if we could talk. She admitted she felt uneasy in her apartment, even though it was perfect on paper. Every payment reminded her it wasn't truly hers yet. Every visit from our parents felt like supervision, not support. She said, "I thought you got left behind. Now I think you got left with something." I didn't correct her. I just listened. The truth was, the suspense I felt at the beginning, waiting for some dramatic reveal, never came. There was no sudden lawsuit, no shocking betrayal, no villain's speech. Just a slow realization that everyone had made choices based on what they could handle, not what was right. And I had been chosen because they believed I could handle silence. I stood one evening in the yard, looking at the land beyond the house. It stretched farther than I had noticed before. Open, quiet, unclaimed by ambition. For the first time, I didn't feel cheated. I felt entrusted. This wasn't a story about a broken house versus a nice apartment. It was about who was willing to sit with discomfort long enough to see its value. My parents gave my sister comfort. They gave me responsibility. And in doing so, they accidentally gave me the one thing no one else wanted to hold, the truth. Once the truth settled, it didn't bring peace the way people imagine it does. It brought distance. Not loud distance, not arguments or slammed doors, but a quiet separation that showed up in pauses, in careful wording, in the way family conversations avoided anything real. My parents stopped asking questions altogether. Not about the house, not about my plans. It was as if acknowledging my choices meant admitting they had made assumptions that no longer held. My sister tried to act normal, but I could feel her measuring every sentence, unsure whether she was allowed to complain about her apartment anymore. I kept working on the house, slowly and deliberately. Not to impress anyone, not to prove a point. I wanted to understand why my grandfather had been so firm about the land. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The location that once felt remote was now quietly valuable. Development had crept closer. Roads improved. Demand grew. The house looked forgotten, but the land was waiting. One afternoon, a man knocked on my door. He introduced himself politely, said he worked with a group interested in the area. He didn't mention numbers at first, just potential, opportunity, progress. I listened without committing to anything. When I asked how he found me, he smiled and said, "People talk." When my parents heard about the visit, panic broke through their calm. They told me not to entertain offers, not to complicate things, not to make decisions that would affect everyone. That was the first time I realized they were afraid, not of losing land, but of losing control over a story they had carefully shaped. My sister surprised me that evening. She admitted she was struggling. The apartment payments were manageable, but the pressure was. She said she felt like she had chosen safety over substance, and now she wasn't sure what she owned and what owned her. For the first time, there was no comparison between us, just honesty. I told her I wasn't planning to sell, not because of loyalty, not out of spite, but because selling would end the conversation too neatly. Some things deserved to be lived with longer. The house continued to change, not dramatically, but enough to feel alive. The yard cleared. The walls stabilized. The space stopped feeling like a placeholder and started feeling intentional. Neighbors treated me less like a caretaker and more like an owner. My parents eventually asked if they could visit again. This time, my father walked the boundary lines with me. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Standing there, he finally understood what my grandfather had protected. Not money, not power, time. That was when I realized the suspense of my life wasn't about what would happen next. It was about who would accept what had already happened. I had been given the thing everyone avoided because it required patience, accountability, and the willingness to stand alone for a while. My sister had been given certainty. I had been given possibility. Neither was easy, but only one could grow. By the time winter arrived, the house no longer felt like something temporary I was passing through. It felt claimed. Not in a legal sense, that part was already clear, but in the way your routines settle into a place and make it yours without asking permission. I knew which floorboard complained in the morning, which window needed extra pressure to close, which corner of the yard caught the sun just before it disappeared. That was when the pressure returned, quietly. My parents didn't come directly at first. It started with small suggestions. My mother mentioned how stressful it must be to manage repairs alone. My father casually asked if I had thought about long-term plans. Nothing explicit, nothing threatening. Just a gentle push toward a decision they were hoping I would make on my own. Then the calls started coming more frequently. Not from them, from people I didn't know. Some were polite, others impatient. A few tried to sound friendly, like they were doing me a favor by offering a way out. The amounts they hinted at were vague but tempting, enough to fix everything, enough to make the house irrelevant again. When I told my parents about the calls, my father went quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, "You don't owe this place anything." I knew what he meant, but he was wrong. I didn't owe the place, I owed myself clarity. My sister visited that weekend. She walked through the house slowly, really seeing it for the first time. Not as a joke, not as a comparison, but as a space with weight. She admitted she felt trapped in her apartment, tied to schedules and payments and expectations. "I thought stability would feel lighter," she said. "It doesn't." We talked honestly, without trying to fix each other. She asked if I resented her. I told her the truth. That resentment only made sense when you believed there was a single version of fairness. This wasn't that kind of situation. The next week, my parents asked me to meet them. Not at the house, somewhere neutral. My father finally said out loud what had been circling for months. He said they had hoped I would sell. That selling would simplify things. That they were tired of carrying a responsibility they never wanted in the first place. I asked why they didn't just say that earlier. My mother said, because then it would feel like pressure. We all sat with that for a moment. I told them I wasn't selling. Not now, maybe not ever. I said I was willing to take on the legal cleanup, the maintenance, the long-term planning. But I wouldn't make the choice for their comfort. That part was important. It was the first time I had drawn a boundary that didn't come with an apology. They didn't argue. They didn't agree either. They just nodded like people realizing the conversation had shifted somewhere they couldn't steer anymore. After that, things changed subtly. The calls slowed. The neighbors relaxed. The house felt steadier, as if the ground itself approved of the decision. I started planning beyond repairs, planting trees, improving drainage, mapping out the land properly. Slow work, unimpressive work. The kind that only matters years later. My sister began visiting more often, not to escape her apartment, but to be part of something that wasn't finished yet. We talked about our childhood, about the roles we were assigned without realizing it. She admitted she had always been afraid of uncertainty. I admitted I had learned to live inside it. One evening, as we sat outside watching the light fade, she said, "They thought they were protecting us." I said, "They were protecting themselves." Neither of us said it with anger. The house stood behind us, quiet and solid, no longer something to be explained or justified. It didn't need defending. It just needed time. And for the first time since those keys slid across the table, I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, not relief, but ownership in the truest sense. Not just of land or walls, but of the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. That was when I understood the real inheritance wasn't property. It was the freedom to decide what mattered enough to keep. Spring brought attention. Not the loud kind, not headlines or sudden chaos, but a steady awareness that the land was no longer invisible. Survey markers appeared at nearby plots. Construction sounds echoed in the distance. What once felt isolated now felt deliberately untouched, like an island waiting to be noticed. People began speaking differently around me, not asking if I planned to do something with the land, but when. The question assumed inevitability, as if growth was a force that couldn't be resisted. I listened, nodded, and said very little. Silence had taught me more than arguments ever could. My parents watched all of this from a distance. They didn't interfere anymore, but I could tell the situation unsettled them. The land becoming relevant again meant their old decisions couldn't stay buried. My father once admitted he had hoped time would erase the issue completely. Instead, time had brought it back with interest. My sister felt the change too. Her apartment, once a symbol of success, now felt fixed, unchanging. No room to expand, no flexibility. She wasn't unhappy, but she was restless. She told me she had started to understand why our grandfather had resisted selling. He wasn't stubborn, she said. He was patient. That word again. I spent more time talking to neighbors, listening to stories that had never made it into family conversations. about disputes that never went to court, about offers that were tempting but incomplete, about how my grandfather had always said that land wasn't just ground, it was leverage. Not for power, but for choice. One afternoon, a formal offer finally arrived. Clear numbers, clear terms, no pressure, no drama, just a proposal that would have ended the story neatly. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked the boundaries again, slowly, deliberately. I thought about how easy it would be to take the money and call it resolution. I thought about how quickly that ease would disappear. I invited my parents and my sister to the house one last time, not for negotiation, but for clarity. I showed them the land as it was, not as a problem, not as an inheritance, but as a decision waiting to be made. I told them I had received an offer and that I wasn't asking for advice. My mother looked relieved. My father looked conflicted. My sister looked curious. Then I told them I was declining it, not forever, just for now. I explained that selling would turn everything we had avoided into something final, something irreversible. Keeping the land meant living with complexity, yes, but it also meant honoring the reason it had survived this long untouched. My grandfather hadn't protected it out of sentiment. He had protected it so that someone, someday, could choose freely. That someone was me. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just quiet acceptance. My parents finally understood they had passed the responsibility on, whether they meant to or not. My sister finally stopped comparing what she had to what I held. After they left, the house felt peaceful in a way it never had before. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being avoided anymore. I sat on the porch as evening settled in, watching the shadows stretch across the land. The suspense that once defined my relationship with this place was gone. In its place was something steadier, intent. I didn't know exactly what the land would become, but for the first time, I knew it wouldn't become something by accident. The strange thing about closure is that it doesn't arrive with a dramatic moment. It shows up quietly, usually long after you stop waiting for it. For me, it came on an ordinary morning, standing in the yard with a cup of coffee, realizing that the house no longer felt like something I had to explain to anyone. The pressure had faded, the calls had stopped. People still watched the land with interest, but now there was respect in it. The kind that comes when someone understands you won't be rushed. My parents adjusted slowly. They never apologized in the way movies make parents apologize. There were no speeches or tears. Instead, they started asking questions. Real ones. About plans, about boundaries, about what I wanted to do rather than what I should do. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that mattered more. My sister changed too. She stopped defending her apartment as if it needed justification. She admitted it suited the life she wanted right now. No comparisons, no guilt. We learned how to talk to each other without measuring who had more or less. The house continued to improve, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The land stayed open, protected, flexible. It became something people referred to, not something they overlooked. And I realized that this was exactly what my grandfather had intended. Not a monument, not a fortune, but an option. Looking back, the unfairness I felt at the beginning wasn't wrong. It just wasn't the whole story. My parents hadn't trusted me more. They had expected me to endure more. There's a difference. But endurance turned into understanding, and understanding turned into ownership in a way comfort never could. If I had been given the apartment, I would have lived well and never questioned anything. If I had sold the house immediately, I would have moved on and never known what I let go of. Staying forced me to see beyond appearances, beyond ease, beyond what looked like a bad deal. The house didn't make me rich. The land didn't make me powerful. What it gave me was something quieter and harder to explain, the confidence to sit with complexity without needing to escape it. That's the part people don't understand when they hear this story. They think it's about property, about favoritism, about money. It is. It's about being handed something that looks like a burden and choosing not to run from it until it reveals what it actually is. My parents gave my sister certainty. They gave me uncertainty. And in the end, uncertainty gave me the freedom to decide my own version of success.